Everyone has heard of the Inca Empire. The mountain cities, the gold, the roads that stretched for 40,000 kilometers across the Andes. The Inca are one of the most studied civilizations in history. But there is a civilization that came 500 years before them in the same mountains that built almost everything the Inca are famous for. The Inca knew about them. They walked the same roads they had built. They administered conquered peoples using the same system. They stored food in the same type of warehouses, organized labor in the same way, used textiles as political currency in exactly the same tradition. And then they rewrote history to pretend these people had never existed. The civilization is called the Wari. They rose around 600 CE, built the first true empire in Andean South America, and collapsed around 1000 CE, 4 centuries before the Inca even came to power. Today, almost nobody outside of archaeology has heard of them. The Inca made sure of that. To understand the Wari, you have to understand where they came from. In the centuries before 600 CE, the Andes were a fragmented world. Regional cultures, local chiefdoms, no single power controlling large territories. Then, in the Ayacucho basin of modern Peru, a city began to grow. Huari, the Wari capital, would eventually cover over 1,500 hectares and house tens of thousands of people. Huari was unlike anything that had existed in the Andes before it. Massive D-shaped ceremonial halls, multi-story stone architecture, underground galleries. The city was planned, not simply accumulated, a deliberate act of imperial construction. By the 7th century CE, Huari was one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere. The Wari did not just build a city. They built an empire. At their peak, Wari influence stretched roughly 1,500 kilometers along the Andean spine, from the northern highlands down through the central coast. They conquered, they administered, they extracted. And to hold an empire together across the brutal Andean terrain, they had to solve the same problems every empire solves. The first problem was movement. An empire cannot function if its armies, goods, and administrators cannot move quickly. The Wari built roads, not paths, roads. Engineered routes across mountain passes, through valleys, connecting the capital to the provinces. This road network is the direct ancestor of the famous Inca road system. The Inca did not invent Andean roads. They inherited them. The second problem was administration. Conquered people need to be counted, taxed, organized. The Wari solution was standardized provincial administrative centers. Large, planned compounds built in conquered territories to serve as the physical apparatus of imperial control. Archaeologists have found these centers across the former Wari territory, all following recognizable architectural templates. The Inca later built the same thing. They called them Tambos. The third problem was labor. The Wari Empire ran on compulsory labor, a system where conquered communities owed a certain amount of work to the state. Build roads, carry supplies, farm state fields, work in state construction projects. This system, which modern scholars call the Mita, became the economic backbone of Inca civilization. The word the Inca used for it was almost certainly borrowed from Wari administrative tradition. The fourth problem was loyalty. How do you bind conquered elites to your empire? The Wari answer was textiles, finely woven cloth. Intricate geometric patterns on tunics called uncus served as markers of imperial rank, gifts of allegiance, tools of political negotiation. A conquered lord who received a Wari tunic from the capital was being told, "You are part of the system now." The Inca built their entire gift economy on this exact tradition. The fifth problem was food security. An empire in the Andes faces dramatic altitude variation, unpredictable rainfall, and frequent crop failures. The Wari response was terrace agriculture and state storage. They carved hillsides into agricultural terraces to maximize productive land and built large stone warehouse complexes to store surplus food and redistribute it to workers, armies, and disaster zones. Walk through any Inca site today and you will see the same terraces, the same warehouses. The Wari also spread religion. Their iconography, particularly a front-facing deity holding staffs, known by scholars as the staff god, traveled across the Andes through Wari expansion. This religious imagery appeared on textiles, ceramics, and architecture from Ecuador to Bolivia. The Inca incorporated versions of this tradition into their own mythology. The god the Inca called Viracocha carries echoes of Wari religious concepts that had been circulating in the Andes for centuries. By the 9th century CE, the Wari Empire was at its height. Its roads were traveled by state runners carrying goods and messages. Its provincial centers administered millions of people. Its textiles were the currency of political relationships across the continent. The Inca would not come to power for another 400 years. The Wari had already solved every problem the Inca would later claim to have invented solutions for. And then the Wari collapsed. Around 1000 CE, the empire fragmented. The capital at Huari was abandoned. Provincial centers fell out of use. The road network stopped being maintained. Within a generation or two, the empire that had dominated the Andes for 4 centuries was gone. The causes remained debated: prolonged drought, internal political fragmentation, the exhaustion of the imperial model. Probably some combination of all three. At one of the Wari's southernmost outposts, a site called Cerro Baul in the Moquegua Valley, archaeologists found evidence of how the collapse played out at the local level. The Wari had shared this frontier with another major Andean civilization, the Tiwanaku, for centuries, a diplomatic border zone. When the end came, the Wari elites at Cerro Baul did something remarkable. They held a feast, a massive one. The evidence shows they brewed enormous quantities of chicha, fermented corn beer, enough for hundreds of people. They invited their guests. They drank. And then, when the feast was over, they smashed the brewery. Deliberately. Every ceramic vessel, every piece of brewing equipment, broken and burned. Then they set fire to the buildings and walked away. This was not a panicked collapse. This was a planned, ceremonial ending. The Wari elites at Cerro Baul chose how their outpost would end. They marked the occasion with ritual destruction and departed in order. Archaeologists call this pattern deliberate ending of occupation through ceremony, a signature of Wari elite behavior. The Inca, who claimed to have invented everything, were inheriting the ruins of a civilization that had even ritualized its own disappearance. After 1000 CE, the Andes entered a period of fragmentation. Smaller regional kingdoms competed for power. The Wari sites were abandoned, overgrown, eventually forgotten by most people living near them. The roads remained. The terraces remained. The institutional memory of how to run an Andean empire remained, distributed across descendant communities who had once lived inside it. The Inca began as a small ethnic group in the Cusco Valley. Around 1400 CE, under the ruler Pachacuti, they began a rapid expansion. Within roughly a century, the Inca had conquered an area stretching from modern Colombia to central Chile, the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. The speed of this conquest is extraordinary. Part of the explanation is that they were not building from nothing. As the Inca expanded, they encountered the ruins of the Wari everywhere. In the Cusco Valley itself, just a few kilometers from their capital, sat Pikillacta, a massive Wari administrative center covering over 40 hectares with over 700 buildings on a strict grid plan. It had been abandoned for 4 centuries. The Inca had no written records explaining who built it. The structures were too large, too organized to be dismissed. The Inca response to Pikillacta and other Wari sites was a mixture of awe, fear, and strategic appropriation. Their oral traditions described the builders of these ruins as powerful beings from before the current age. Not quite human, not quite divine. They made offerings at Wari sites rather than destroying them. They built Inca structures near them. To stand near that, power was to claim some of it. Meanwhile, the Inca were systematically adopting the Wari institutional toolkit. The road network was extended and formalized into the Chapak Nan, the royal road, using the same engineering logic the Wari had developed. The administrative center system became the Inca Tambo network. The Mita labor system became the foundation of the Inca economy. The textile gift tradition became the cornerstone of Inca diplomacy. This borrowing was not accidental or unconscious. The Inca were a sophisticated imperial power. They understood that they were inheriting infrastructure and institutions that had been tested across centuries and vast territories. They adapted what worked, improved what could be improved, and rebranded the entire system as Inca invention. The administrative centers got new Inca facades. The roads got Inca relay stations. The labor system got Inca bureaucratic language. The most consequential form of erasure was mythological, the Inca origin story. The official version maintained by the state and passed on through Khipu record keepers, placed the beginning of civilization at Lake Titicaca. The sun god Inti created the first Inca, Manco Capac, and sent him to found Cusco. Before Inca civilization, according to Inca history, there was nothing worth remembering. This was deliberate. The Inca state controlled historical narrative through the Khipu system, knotted cord records maintained by specialist record keepers called Quipucamayucs. What the Quipucamayucs recorded became official history. What they omitted ceased to exist in the cultural record. The Wari were not recorded. 4 centuries of prior empire were written out of Andean history by the civilization that inherited it. When the Spanish arrived in 1532 and began recording Inca history, interviewing elders, documenting oral traditions, they recorded what the Inca told them. The Wari barely appear in early Spanish colonial sources. A few references to mysterious ancient ruins, vague traditions about powerful beings from a prior age. The Wari had been so thoroughly erased from Inca official memory that the Spanish had almost nothing to write down about them. For the next 4 centuries, the Wari remained archaeological background noise. European scholars focused on the Inca, then the Aztec, then the Maya. The Wari were a collection of ruins without a story. It was not until the 20th century that systematic archaeological work began to reveal the scale of what had existed. The breakthrough came through the ruins themselves. Pikillacta was excavated beginning in the 1960s and 70s. The site revealed a level of urban planning, strict grid layout, standardized room sizes, centralized water management that matched no known Inca pattern. It was clearly older, clearly different, clearly the product of a separate imperial tradition. Archaeologists began asking, who built this? The answer emerged gradually through decades of excavation across Peru. Huari, the Wari capital, turned out to be enormous. A city whose full extent had been invisible because it had been looted for building stone for centuries. Provincial centers like Viracocha Pampa in the northern highlands revealed a standardized administrative architecture that clearly predated Inca expansion. The pattern became undeniable. One of the most striking pieces of evidence came from the textiles. Wari tunics, preserved in dry coastal burial conditions, showed the same geometric interlocking patterns, the same use of fine camelid fiber, the same iconographic tradition that would later define Inca elite cloth. The textile tradition did not begin with the Inca. It stretched back through Wari to even earlier Andean cultures, a centuries-long accumulation that the Inca presented as their own innovation. The Mita labor system left traces too. Documents from the early Spanish colonial period describe a system whose logic goes back further than the Inca can explain. When Spanish administrators tried to understand the Mita, they found that the communities subject to it had been practicing it for generations before the Inca arrived. The Inca had not introduced the system. They had formalized a pre-existing Andean tradition. The road evidence is perhaps the clearest. Survey work on the Chapacnan has found Wari period construction beneath Inca period resurfacing on multiple stretches. The Inca were not building roads in empty mountain terrain. They were rebuilding and extending roads that already existed, roads whose original construction predates Inca expansion by 400 years. What makes the Wari case particularly striking is the combination of copying and denial. Other civilizations have borrowed from predecessors. This is normal in history. What is unusual is the completeness of the erasure. The Inca did not simply fail to mention the Wari. They constructed a cosmology and a state history in which no prior empire could have existed because the Inca were, by divine definition, the first. This had consequences for how the Inca understood their own ruins. Pikillacta was not just left alone. The Inca deliberately filled portions of it with gravel, a behavior that looks like ritual decommissioning, not simple abandonment. The Wari had done the same thing at Cerro Baul. The Inca were performing a ceremony they did not understand the origin of on a site built by people they had erased from memory. There is something almost paradoxical about the Inca's relationship with the Wari. They feared the ruins enough to make offerings at them. They used the sites enough to build near them and incorporate them into their sacred landscape. They copied the institutional systems thoroughly enough that modern scholars could reconstruct the Wari from Inca patterns alone. But in their official history, the Wari did not exist. The Wari story is not just about one civilization borrowing from another. It is about how empires construct their own legitimacy. The Inca needed to be first. They needed to be divinely created, unprecedented, the origin point of civilization in the Andes. Acknowledging the Wari would have undermined not just their historical narrative, but their claim to rule. Because if the Inca were copying a prior empire, they were not divinely inspired. They were inheritors. Modern Andean archaeology has now mapped the Wari legacy with considerable precision. The road stretches, the provincial center templates, the textile traditions, the labor systems, the storage infrastructure. All of it predates the Inca by centuries and maps almost exactly onto what the Inca later built. The archaeological consensus is clear. The Inca Empire was, in significant part, a Wari revival operating under a different brand. The Wari never developed a surviving writing system. Like the Inca, they administered their empire through other means: textiles, architectural standardization, and specialist record keepers. This means we cannot read Wari documents. Everything we know comes from what they built, what they buried, and the faint traces they left in Inca institutions that tried to erase them. The Inca Empire was destroyed by Spanish conquest in 1532. Within decades, the Inca state and most of its institutional memory were gone. The Spanish built their colonial system on Inca infrastructure, using Inca roads, Inca administrative centers, even a modified version of the Inca Mita to extract labor from indigenous communities. The pattern continued, each new empire inheriting the bones of the one before, rebranding them as innovation. The Wari built the first Andean empire. The Inca took the blueprint, expanded it, and claimed it as divine inspiration. The Spanish took the Inca infrastructure and called it conquest. Each one stood on the shoulders of the civilization before it and called those shoulders the ground. The Wari are invisible in popular history not because they were minor, they were not minor, but because the people who inherited everything they built had very good reasons to make sure you never heard of them.